the videos, from today, well, the video tonight, they're going to be able to take the terms and they're going to be able to apply them. They're going to see through the illustration with the stories that we've read so far this semester, how they apply. And if it takes the full hour, then it does. And if it doesn't, then that's great. And we'll just go whenever we're done. So we'll see how we go with that. Okay, so as far as fiction is concerned, the first chapter that we talked about is they were just mainly talking about fiction itself. And many of their examples are novels, like Huckleberry Finn, which they mentioned on the first page of that chapter, that's a novel. And it's actually, Huck Finn is in another one of his books, which isn't nearly as good. Huckleberry Finn is a fantastic book. It's a great read. And Huckleberry Finn is a fantastic character. He's great. He meets actually a runaway slave in the book, and the runaway slave is fantastic. His name's Jim, and he is a great character. And so it's a funny story, but it's also meaningful. It says a lot. He definitely comments. He's commenting about the fact about what slavery should and shouldn't be, and essentially saying that slaves were people, which was, believe it or not a very popular way of looking at it back in the time he wrote. But 100 years later, it had a profound impact on readers during the civil rights movement, and it still has an effect on people today. In fact, a lot of places have banned the book mainly because they see it as racist, and yet because a lot of those terms that are derogatory are used, and yet the story is effectively about how Huckleberry Finn realizes how inhumane slavery is and how wrong it is, and learns to judge people by what they do, not by what color their skin is. So it's actually the kind of the opposite to an actual racist book. It's kind of non-racist or anti-racist, if you want to put it that way. But the truth is almost all of our stories have some sort of theme. They have some point they're making or some aspect. If you think about slavery or about prejudice, or especially, prejudice against slaves, obviously Desiree's Baby comes out as one of those themes, that the racism that's inherent and really necessary to make all of the bad things happen as they happen in Desiree's Baby. But we have other stories that have prejudice in them as well. And so, so it's not like it's the only place that kind of theme comes out. In Shooting an Elephant, for instance, there's both prejudice between the oppressors, the British, and the British government that's taken over India, well, Burma in this case, one part, but also, there's prejudice against the Burmese people, and from the Burmese people to, that's against the British, kind of that back and forth. In the Treasure short story, that one in particular, they use racial epithets against the Chinese men and show that they're willing even to kill a person and not feel bad about it because he's Chinese. And so that shows those same elements of, or at least similar elements of racism and prejudice. And of course, it doesn't do them any good. They end up, sealing their own fate because of their actions. And in some ways, that lesson is the point, that they jumped in and they took advantage of a situation out of greed, and it's not a good thing. But probably in that story itself, greed is probably more prevalent than racism, because it's their greed that really makes them do the evil stuff. The prejudice just helps them excuse it and not feel bad about it. So the truth is all of that those kinds of themes all come through, and they come through two things. There are two things that are necessary and that are going to be a part of every single story, and that's the narrative and the plot. Now, they're not the same thing. So what is a plot?
Is that just like what's happening in the story?
Yes, that's exactly. It's what happens in the story. So it's the events, that sequence of events that happen in a story. And so that, if I said, tell me the plot of, you're essentially just going to summarize, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, right? So Desiree's baby, first she's found as a foundling, then later on when she's older, you know, the man next door falls in love with her. They get, the dad talks to him about the fact that he doesn't know who her parents really are. He doesn't care. They get married. She gets pregnant. Everything's great. He treats the slaves nice and stuff. And then the baby turns out to be part black, and he gets all freaked out, and he doesn't talk to his wife and kids, and he treats the slaves really bad. Then his wife notices finally, and she writes her mom. Well, she talks to her husband. He says, get out. And she writes her mom, and her mom says, come home. She shows the letter, and he does send her away. And then she goes off into the woods. And then after she's gone, he finds the letter as he's burning all of their stuff. But you see, it's just bop, 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 bop. Here's what happens. Now that narrative, that plot is narrated. So, but it can be narrated in a bunch of different ways, and we're going to talk about a few of those things. But the plot itself it usually follows this kind of a thing, and I'm gonna examine this because these elements could very well be on the test. And we're gonna use some of the other stories, not necessarily Desiree's baby, but we're gonna use some of the other stories to further essentially explain all of this. So we do have a couple of places where this doesn't happen, and I'll give you some exceptions, but for the most part, like for instance, with the shooting an elephant, what is the inciting incident? Because we start out and with what is called the exposition. Okay, and it's highlighted in your book at the top. I just highlighted it right there. Can you see that when I highlight it?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. I was hoping. So in exposition, and that's that first section of this right up here, it's where you get introduced to characters, the setting, situation, what is it, where are we, and who are the people who are going to be involved in this. So, for instance, in shooting an elephant, we find out this guy is a British officer who's kind of serving as a policeman in Burma, and the Burmese people don't like him because of who he represents. Okay, so we get all of this, so we know kind of what's going on. But then at some point, and you see the little place where it's going, mostly it's going across, and then it hits a point where it starts to rise. And that's called, that little point when it flips up is essentially what's called the inciting incident. And I'll stick it in here in the chat. Inciting incident. And so it's the point where the action really starts. So what's the inciting incident for shooting an elephant? The elephant's gone crazy. Until then, he was just an officer. People didn't like him. He didn't like them, but they mostly were just muddling through. But today, he's already on a mission because, as we find out, there's an elephant who ran rampant and did some bad things, broke some stuff, knocked over some things, and then finally stomped a dude and stomped him. He got crushed to death. So he died. It's killed a man. And now this man, who's the officer, has a gun that is not big enough to kill an elephant, but he has to decide what he's going to do as he's walking to the place where the elephant supposedly has stopped and is now no longer killing people. So there's that inciting incident, though, is right there. Sometimes the inciting incident really happens ahead of time. So when you're talking about like the treasure, that treasury, when they're going off into the jungle, we start the story with them already there. But the inciting incident really happened way earlier. They're in a bar somewhere or a restaurant or whatever, and they overhear all these Chinese men talking in pidgin English about a treasure. And that's what makes them start to act. Then we know they killed one, the man who had hidden the treasure, and took his map. But that all happened previously. So but that's still the inciting incident. It's what starts all of the things going towards a dramatic finish. Okay. Without conflict, without an event happening, if the shooting of an elephant, if the elephant hadn't gone crazy, it would just be a boring day in the life of a British officer in Burma. But something happens, and that's what has to happen in these stories. So in The Horse Dealer's Daughter, the daughter is specifically, what's the inciting incident in there? It also had already happened.
The father passing away?
Exactly. So you're smart. Okay, good, Jordan. So Jordan,
Oh.
you're right. The father passed away, and that's made all of these different things happen. So I'm going to pause recording for a second. Somebody just called me, and I need to answer that for a second. Okay, just bear with
Okay.
me. Zoom the recording. I'm so glad I can do that. Okay, so we already have the inciting incident was when the dad died, right? So that makes everything happen. All the other events that happen as a result, in some ways, stem from that inciting incident. And that's kind of the point of all of this. If you watch a movie, it has exposition at the beginning, then it has an inciting incident, then it has what we call rising action through the conflict, and then a climax, and then falling action and a denouement. So it's just all of them. They call this. It's Freitag who came up with it. And I teach this even when I'm doing my writers groups at the Turner Center. If without conflict, there's no story. And so we have to have that point of, inciting incident that sets conflict in motion. So in The Horse Dealer's Daughter, though, what's the conflict that's really going on? It's this girl, and really the doctor too. What is she going to do now? She's facing either being an extra in some family member's life for the rest of her life. She's 27, so she's kind of past the marrying age at this time. She doesn't have, her mom's gone already, so she doesn't have any female figure that's really, prominent in her life. Her dad's now gone too. Her brothers don't want her. Her sister has said she could come live with them, but her sister's married with children, and so she doesn't have a good option. And it's almost conflict. It's conflict, it's her versus all of her circumstances, and she is powerless against all of them. So what does she choose? And she makes movements which the doctor follows as she's going through to get to what? And this is where we get to the climax part. What is she chosen to do that we find out? She doesn't say, she just goes and does it.
She has chosen to commit suicide.
She has chosen to drown herself, yes. And so the doctor, who's, and he kind of has a parallel story, but it's really, the conflict is really her conflict. And that he's just kind of along for the ride, and he ends up becoming part of her story, somewhat out of choice. He chooses to become part of her story. So he's following her, and he's mesmerized by some of the things she's doing, but mostly it's by exchanges in eye contact. Then he follows along with that, and she washes her mom's grave, changes the flowers there, and he just keeps following her, and she walks off into the woods. He keeps following her. Then she gets to a pond, and she just walks right in. And so at that point, that's really the point of highest emotional intensity, where we're all probably reading the book, the story, and going, she did what? I know the first time I read that one, I was so shocked that she had, she's what? What is she? Where's she go? Like, oh my gosh. And she just goes right in, and it goes over her head. And I'm thinking she's committing suicide. And so I'm as shocked as the doctor is. So there's that point of climax. Well, then the doctor is part of the climax too, because he could just, okay, it's probably, I mean, in some ways you could say there are almost two climaxes. Some could say, some might say, well, the climax is really when the doctor says that, but it's his actions that matter. And so it's even more than saying something, because the feelings are already there. It's like, will he admit it? So in some ways, there are almost two climaxes. The biggest one, probably the most dramatic one, and that's why I would pick whatever's the most dramatic, the most shocking. Like think about, in a like a thriller, or in, yeah, let's take a thriller. Just so we take something where somebody is trying, a murderer or whatever, and he's after the person, okay? And then the person, who's in a house alone or whatever it is, well, then she thinks she's beaten the guy down, okay? But, after this huge fight and all this scary stuff, and it's just rising and rising and rising, more and more scary. You want to kind of get up and pace the floor because it's so exciting and scary. And then finally she whacks him. And you think he's gone. And there's always that time, it's American movies, I swear they do this, where he gets, like he's not dead yet. And so he grabs her or something and she has to beat him off again, or, whatever. He has a gun, or, something like that. Well, that's really the minor climax, because the big one was the biggest fight. It's when, if you're watching Alien, when Sigourney Weaver is finally facing the monster itself, one on one. That's where the climax is. And so all of the people who've died because the monster killed them beforehand, those are all rising action. Anything that happens after that, even if she finds babies or did, the eggs or whatever, and, and kills those, that's still, it's what they call anticlimactic. It's not as intense as the climax. Now, can people disagree on what the climax is? Yes. That's exactly right, Jordan. And sometimes, I mean, typically the climax, like, it's not a pyramid, because even though it's called Freytag's pyramid, because it's the point, the climax point is always more towards the end than towards the beginning. Falling action, the stuff that happens after the climax, is all inevitable. So, and probably, if I asked D.H. Lawrence, so where's the climax in this? He would probably pick out the saving her from being, um, from committing suicide, for two reasons. One, because it shifts completely and irrevocably the path that the woman takes in that story. The other thing is that it shifts irrevocably what the doctor feels towards her. It changes their relationship forever, because he saved her, because he risked his life to save her, because he almost, he could have drowned saving her, because he lugged her all the way home, even though he was exhausted and suffering from a really severe cold. He sacrificed to such a great extent whatever strength and health he had left, and it was because of his responses. You can call it that too. Yeah, it's that moment where everything comes true. But see, everything from that point on becomes inevitable. It's that moment that makes everything just fall into place. She realizes some person cares about her when she thought pretty much no one did. And she realizes too that she has the same connection to him that he has to her, or that she thinks it has to her. And he has to, it takes him a while, but he comes to grips with the fact that he already has feelings for her, and has had feelings that he never really acknowledged. He's found her to be compelling for a long time. And even though all he's done really is exchange a few words with her, and then eyes, just yes. And so, but it finally, the truth comes out of their mouths. Like they acknowledge reality. Instead of being the little polite people, she is no longer polite. She's going to ask him hard questions. And he's going to, instead of just dismissing them, he might dismiss them in his head, but then he thinks through them, and then he admits the truth. And that moment, essentially, in some ways, I have a lot of hope for that couple, because they both go from polite niceties where they cover everything that they're struggling with, up to truth. And they're being extremely honest and truthful to each other, and direct. in a way that they haven't been with everyone else. And so this is the really the makings of a very solid relationship. If you're lying to your significant other, it's not going to last. It's not going to be good. It's going to end up toxic, or it's going to end. And so, truth, honesty within a relationship is so crucial, and they are being utterly, vulnerable and honest with each other. I think it's sweet too, Jordan. And so essentially we have what's called falling action, which is much quicker than the rising action. Although it's a little longer in the D.H. Lawrence thing, because it takes a while for the doctor to get to the point where he admits and understands what he's feeling and admits it to her. And then we have essentially the denouement, which is, you can also call it the resolution. And so in the resolution, really you tie up stuff so that we know what happened to people and everything's kind of settled. We do have a few stories where the denouement doesn't quite settle everything. Like sometimes that we still have open-ended sort of somethings. Like in Desiree's Baby, we don't know exactly what happens to Desiree. We just assume from the narration that she died and she took her baby with her and probably ended up drowned in the bayou because of where she was going. We don't know exactly what happens to Armand at the end of that either. We know, though, that he burns the letter and he burns all her stuff. So it doesn't seem like he's going to change course and become a nice guy. Does that make sense? So in the end, though, most of the time we get a very strong resolution. In the Mask of the Red Death, there is a definitely strong resolution. Everybody, what is it, in a tragedy, what, everybody dies? Well, that kind of is what happened. And so those kinds of resolutions, of course, are going to be pretty solid. Now, even though this is the plot, and this pretty much follows I could ask you, what's the climax? Honestly, what's the climax of shooting an elephant? The point when he shoots the elephant. Up until that point, we're not going to be sure, is he going to shoot the elephant or not? That's the biggest question. And he puts in all these reasons for and against it all the way through the narrative until finally he chooses. And then here's the fallout. And he shows what happens to the elephant, how long it takes to die, what the people do. They start ripping up parts of it. I mean, it's just horrible. And then he kind of resolves all of it by essentially expressing the fact that he still regrets. He did it for the wrong reasons, and he's fessing up to that, I guess. So how it's resolved, of course, is up to each individual writer, and each individual story is going to be somewhat different, but they all have this same kind of map that they go through. Rising, first they have the exposition, then that inciting incident, then they go up into the rising action all the way to the climax. Then they have the falling action and the denouement or resolution. So every single story does this. Even if the parts it narrates, like in that treasure poem, treasure story, even if those events are related later, they happened in a certain order. The other thing that's interesting is when we get to narration, and I don't know if, yeah, it goes right into the story of an hour, but with narration, that's totally different. So a narrative is not the same thing as a plot. Narrative is kind of how the story is told. And you could certainly say that probably most of our stories are third person narration. And I'm just going to put this in here. All that means, though, is that the narrator is talking about all the characters in third person. So I don't know if you remember much about grammar, but first person is when you use a first person pronoun is I. I did this, I thought that, so using first person is pretty common for us. I tell my own story. You can also use the word we. There are a few stories where we is actually the narrative, and it's different. There's a short story called A Rose for Emily, which if you take American literature, you'll probably read. It's by William Faulkner, but it's told from the we point of view. The townspeople are narrating the story. Most first person narration, though, is I did this, I said that. You'll notice, though, that pretty much our stories are all not first person. There are very few people. Shooting an elephant is one of the exceptions. where he talks about, he uses the word I and my choice and my actions and my, um, that's one of the exceptions. We also have, though, and what's more common is third person narration. And that means people are saying things like, he did this and she did that, and he said this and she, so the almost everything that we've read is third person. But third person doesn't have, there are different kinds of third person. And I'm going to talk about some of these. So third person, and I'm just going to use a few words. So one is called omniscient. Third person omniscient is like there's a narrator, and that narrator knows everything. They know what people are doing, what they're saying. They know everything that happens in every scene. They know what people are thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. So now the Harry Potter books are, they are third person and they are partially omniscient, because we don't necessarily get into the thought process of every character. That we do get in, whose mind do we typically get into in the Harry Potter books? Harry Potter, right? So he is what's called limited omniscient. And this is much more common today. Like, Harry Potter is a recent enough novel. It's much more common narrative form today, where we get inside one person's head. Now, we do have a few people like Nicholas Sparks, and I'm not a huge fan for one reason. It's because he uses first person narrative, but he gets first person narrative from all of the different characters. And so every chapter can be a different person. And for me, it's really jarring. Usually limited omniscient is used so that we kind of know who the main character is. So we're in Harry's head because, we know what's going on through Harry's mind, and we are really, he's the main character, and everything that happens to him is what matters the most to us. So we may like other characters, like I love Hermione, but Hermione's not the main character, because all we really get from Hermione is what Harry either thinks she's doing or doing it for, what he thinks is motivating her, or what she says and does on the outside. So we don't really get inside her brain. Like, I can't ask her, why did you fall for Ron Weasley of all people? And because I don't get to see inside her brain and see those choices. So a lot of what they do and say can really reveal a lot, but we don't get inside their heads. And so that's typical. You'll notice even in, for instance, The Treasure in the Forest, we really only get inside one of the two men's brains. We get in the one who ends up watching his friend die. Well, his buddy anyway. But we get into his thoughts. He's worried about the body. He's not so concerned about the gold. So there's all this, we get a little bit, where when they feel the prick of the little thorn, we get some of that they sense this, but a lot of it's still on the outside. We do have what's called, essentially, it's fully limited, where they're not, it's just, what do they call it? I want to make sure and get the right term. It's not limited omniscience. It's essentially, they're not omniscient at all. And sometimes it's just limited. And yeah, that's what I think it is. It's just limited. And that means they don't get any. It's like we're watching a play or watching a movie, and we don't get to hear what anybody's thinking. We only see what they do and we hear what they say, and that's it. And so we have to interpret from that what's really going on. What are they actually thinking? And a lot of times in modern literature, that's what we get. That's the kind of narration that we get. Ernest Hemingway, who wrote Old Man and the Sea and a bunch of other stuff, his narratives were almost all limited, where he will tell you what people are saying. He'll give you the dialogue, what they do, the actions they take, if they're drinking a drink, whatever it is, but he doesn't tell you anything. He's not inside anybody's brain. Older fiction, we tend to be much more inside people's heads. So, for instance, you're going to read a story called The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote about the same time as Poe. And in the book, in that particular story, we get into both the main character, who's a scientist, and we get a little bit into the brain of, or the mind of, his wife. More into his mind than hers, but we get into a little bit of both. There's another character, though, that we only really get his dialogue. We don't get to see inside of his brain. So it's not fully omniscient. And honestly, today, very few texts would ever be fully omniscient. That's one reason Nicholas Sparks is a problem for me, because we get into this main character, then we get into this girl that he likes, and each person's telling this first person narrative, and it just constantly switches to the mom and then the dad and the sister, and then all of a sudden the murderer is telling the story, and I'm just like, y'all, there's so many different people talking, and sometimes that gets really hard. It's kind of like, have you ever seen Field of Dreams? And if you haven't, then I can't use it as an example. Okay. I'm trying to think of who else. Have you seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? No. Okay. Well, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is interesting because he actually talks directly to the audience. He breaks the fourth wall, which movies almost never do. But he's a main character in the narrative, but he also sometimes looks directly at us and says things. And so that's, interesting. But the truth is because he does that, we know he's the main character. And so there are certainly, in movies, there are often clues where the camera is. Cameras tend to be closer to the main character than they are to people that the main character opposes. Um, okay, well, that's understandable. But the truth is those narratives define what it is we're supposed to know. And sometimes they leave things out. They don't tell us everything because we have to kind of extrapolate. Like, we don't get inside the mind of, we probably get inside the mind more of Desiree than we do Armand in Desiree's Baby. Although she doesn't tell us at the end, we don't say, well, she decided to commit suicide. It doesn't tell us that. So it's mostly limited. In The Story of an Hour, however, same author, we do get inside that room with Mrs. Mallard where she says body and soul free. And then right as soon as she says that out loud, we're going, what? And the narration takes on all the things she's thinking. And so we don't get in the mind of anybody else. We only get in the mind of Mrs. Mallard, but that makes her the main character. Does that make sense? But that's all because of narration. And now we're going to scroll down. If I can get all the way. This was so. Let me close this out for a second, and I'll be right back. It's easier to scroll through long stuff. Doodly doodly do. To get to where we need to be. Man, all these. Okay, so now we have drama. Now I gotta get to chapter 8. Sorry, I'm gonna have to scroll all the way through. La, 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 la. That's the play we're gonna read. There's the Shakespearean play. Oh, there's 7. Okay, and now we 8. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so when we talk about literary analysis, and there are just a few terms that are in here, because I wanted you to be able to, kind of look at all this. Let me see. But it might be that they don't even have it. Because I wanted to talk about character. Obviously, I've talked about the elements of plot. Where is it? I thought they talked to it. No, they didn't. Darn it. Okay, so let me just unshare this. Let me stop. And let's talk a little bit about character, because I want to make sure it is as much as possible that you look at, at least what we're talking about when we talk about character. So, we've covered plot and we've covered narration, but in character, and this matters not only to people who are reading, but also to people who are writing. I just want to, get, I guess, the key terms. The truth is we have a number of different things that we're dealing with, and I guess I'll just put it in chat. That's probably the best thing to do. And that's that, with, and I did ask you a question on one of the journals, and a lot of students were like, what? I don't even know what those mean. We talked about round versus flat characters, and we talked about static versus dynamic characters. And so, some people, it's hard. I mean, one thing I can tell you, I did have one, and I don't agree with it, but I did have one teacher once tell me that short stories, because they're short, make it impossible for you to have round characters. So what a round character, and you think about it, instead of round and flat, I mean, I guess that's a simplistic term, but it's more like complex versus simple, or even stereotypical. So a round like a flat character, think about, I don't know, have you seen the Barbie movie? This is at least more recent. It's not an old movie. Okay, you haven't seen that either. Okay, but you know what Barbie is, right? You know the Barbie dolls and Ken dolls and stuff like that. And one thing that the Barbie movie does is it starts with simple and it moves complex, which honestly a lot of movies do. You might start with a character being pretty, or a character being tough, or we get that visual picture of the character first. And then as you get to know the character, they become more and more complex often. In Barbie becomes more complex, and only she's learning to become more complex. She starts out like a little doll. Everything's perfect. Her life is the same every single day. It's simple, simple, simple. She doesn't really think deeply about anything, that kind of stuff. But then she learns to think more deeply. She learns that the world is more complex than she thought it was. She's sad at times. She, finds her life too simple and broadens, wants to move further. That's kind of it's almost like, are they really simply done where they're just stereotypes, like the bad guy, or the young lady who, love interest, who's beautiful and, pretty much, dippy or something. No, that's the flat character. It could be that someone's always angry and that's just who they are. Even the two men, like in The Treasure in the Forest, the two men are both, they're a little different. They're differentiated enough, to make them so they're real characters. And yet we don't know much more beyond the fact that one of them seems to be more impetuous and rushes in, where the other one is a bit more tentative and doesn't take the same risks. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. But we don't know anything about their background. We don't know anything about where they come from, except that they're both not Chinese, obviously. The three other men, the Chinese people who were talking, we know nothing about practice. Two of them are just Chinese. That's the only, they would be Chinese man number one and Chinese man number two if we made a movie. Even the third one, the one who hid the gold, we don't know much about him except a couple of strange things. Like, we know, first of all, that yes, he's the one who talked about gold, but then we know he grinned when they were about to kill him. And we don't know why. Now we find out later why. It's because he knows they're going to go and die. So he's not, yes, he knows he's going to die, but he knows they're going to get what they deserve too. And so that makes him a little more complex, but he's still pretty simple. Of all of the characters that we've covered in the story so far, can you think of which ones you think are probably the most complex or the most round, as they would put them? Which characters seem the roundest to you? What would you say?
The doctor and the horse dealer's daughter seem fairly,
I
complex.
agree. He might be the most complex of any of the
Because he was so
characters.
conflicted.
Right. And well, and it's what he's feeling is very complex. So complex that he can't really, he goes through that whole denial of things and then, but what am I really feeling? And he does stuff without really understanding why he's doing it. And then it comes afterwards why, like he realizes things about himself and about her, even as he's investigating it. So, and because we get to see inside his brain, because it's almost like one character starts out being the main character, Mabel does, and then he takes over. Dr. Ferguson becomes the main character. And yet, in a way, they both share it. We just don't get inside her brain as much as we did get inside at the beginning. Remember, she doesn't answer her brothers, and the narration says, well, they wouldn't listen to her anyway. She was used to being talked at and around, but not talked to. And so we get inside some of her brain stuff, and we certainly get to see a glimpse of how she views the doctor and his actions. But then it takes the doctor a while to figure out what he really feels. It's very human. It's almost like what's complex is what's closer to real people, and what's flat is more like the stereotype. Desiree, for instance, is probably more complex than Armand, but in the end, she's still pretty simple. She loves Armand. She is, even though she's freaked out about the fact that he, treats his slaves bad, and then she's really freaked out about the fact that he wants her gone. And that is enough for her to commit suicide. But it's almost like we get to the point where we get to with Mabel walking into the water. And that's as far as we get with her character development. And then with Armand, he's just a racist who thinks he's in love with his wife. And as soon as he realizes that she's probably part black, then he's not in love with her anymore. I mean, he's not very complex. And even in the end, he finds out the truth. Does he make any change? No. He just burns the evidence so that no one will know. And so he really doesn't, show much complexity at all. He's very, he's probably snooty. Um, he's mean and self-centered. There are a few things like that. So is he more on the complex scale than some? Yeah. Another complex character is probably the guy in Shooting an Elephant, because he's really struggling, kind of like the doctor. He's struggling with his choices. He's struggling with why he's doing what he's doing, or why he'll make one choice or another, and can even be. A choice, and so that's very complex. That's very human. And even with the two men in Treasure in the Forest, they probably regret what they did too late, because by then they're dying. But even how much did Evans really regret? He died too quickly. Who knows? And we don't get inside his head, so we don't know. So in the end, the vast majority of our characters in here are really flat. And even the characters, for the most part, in what we're reading for tonight, the Mask of the Red Death, it's really very flat. Who the characters are, doesn't matter as much as what they're doing and what happens to them. So they're very simple and very, very flat. I mean, and does that make sense? All of that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now the other part, and I said static versus dynamic. I don't know if you can tell just from the terms. Dynamic means that they change. Static means that they don't change. That's really it. So static stays in one place, and dynamic is movement and shifting. So you could say, for instance, that the Mrs. Mallard is actually a dynamic character, even though she's static in real life, the fact that she doesn't actually get to take any leaps action wise, but her mind shifts. Her emphasis in her life shifts dramatically because of what's happened, because of her, finding out that Mr. Mallard had died. I mean, she does grieve at first, but then she shifts and she starts thinking about hopefully, how her life is going to be now that she's a widow. And then once she finds out dramatically that he's not dead, then her life shifts so quickly that it kills her. Does that make sense? So she's
Yeah.
dynamic. Her husband is not. He's exactly the same at the beginning as he was at the end, except now we know he's not dead. But he was the same dude all the way through. He just didn't, he was unaware of what was going on. Um, what about in The Horse Dealer's Daughter? Those two characters, at least the two main characters. Obviously, the brothers, we only get a glimpse at the beginning. For the most part, they're just going to keep on going in their direction no matter what. So they're static. Are Dr. Ferguson and Mabel dynamic or static?
I think so.
I think they're both dynamic. I mean, she's obviously, if she fought him like at the end when he was trying to not, keep her from drowning, and she's like, no, I want to die, and she never changes her mind, and she's mad at him because she was going to go die. Well, that's static, but she shifts because of the actions he took. She shifts her point of view. She shifts her own opinions of both herself and him in pretty fast fashion. So she's kind of quick on the uptake. It takes Dr. Ferguson a bit to shift too, but he does shift. And in the end, he seems pretty sure that he's in love with her. And that all of these weird feelings that he's been kind of fighting and denying and misinterpreting and or just being mystified by become clear. And they even kind of the way the force with which he feels them, even it's scary to him, but it's also scary to her, and yet they're both willing to take a leap. That's very dynamic. So they both of them, they start out the beginning very solitary, very lonely, very much on their own and feeling isolated, and they end up in a totally different situation, much of it because they're both willing to change. Had either one of them said no, this could not have the story could not have happened. They both had to change for the story to happen the way that it did. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so what about let me think. I'm trying to think of which ones I can do. I already talked about the thing in the forest. Now I got to look back. What about The Secret Life of Walter Mitty? Is Walter Mitty a round character or a flat character? First of all,
Um, well, we do get to see a little of what he's thinking, so not completely flat.
no, he has, it's all in his imagination, but it's a very active imagination. And that's actually, I mean, I like him because of that, because I have a very active imagination. So, yeah, he's probably, his wife would say he's flat. But he doesn't share any of the thoughts that we know about, all these imaginative, the operating room and the lawyers stuff, and the courtroom and all of this dramatic, the airplane flight. It's all really imaginative and funny. It's funny. It's got everything. He's going to be a great writer someday. But on the surface, nobody knows any of that. His wife does, he's just she thinks he's just spacing out and he needs to go to the doctor. But there's more to him than this narrative that he's been given in his life. And so his imagination is filling all of the bad, the empty spots. And so he's more complex. But is he dynamic or is he static?
I think he's more static because he's daydreaming at the beginning and then he's daydreaming at the end.
Right. He's not actually going to go do anything. And it's funny because in the movie, of course, you remember what I said. That one guy said, well, in a short story, you can't have complex, round, dynamic characters. They have to be static and flat. And I don't agree with him. But in the movie, especially the later movie, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, with Ben Stiller in it, he has to make a choice. Is he going to stay in his daydreams or is he going to act? And in the movie, he chooses to act. And he does a huge dynamic shift. So he was complex at the beginning, but and it became even more complex as the movie goes along, but he was very much static in the beginning, and you have to reach that point where he starts going into the dynamic part, and that's really fascinating, and it's very much part of character analysis too, so it's a good illustration of that kind of thing. What about and there was one other one I wanted to, oh, the blind men and the elephant, are those characters flat or round, and are they static or dynamic?
They seem pretty flat
Yes.
and static.
Yes. And that's the thing, is remember at the end, they each have their own little story. Oh, that one of them felt the trunk, and he thought, and one felt the leg and he thought it was a tree. They all had different interpretations, but none of them would listen to the other ones. None of them would learn. And so because of that, they all end up static, and they all end up with a very limited viewpoint. So in some ways, a lot of these stories will even show us that if you refuse to change and you refuse to learn, you will, you're losing out. Armand, had he been willing to let go of his prejudices, could have had a happy marriage and been a much nicer person too. But he wasn't willing. And so he ended up making, not only, causing the deaths of his wife and child, but, well, inadvertently, but I mean, his life ends up probably miserable because he chose that. He chose not to change. So, and it's the same thing with Horse Dealer's Daughter and things like that. Those choices matter. Are you willing to adapt to new circumstances and cling on to hope? And if you're not, what are your options at that point? And the truth is they're not fantastic if you're not willing to make that shift. So a lot of times the static characters are either the ones that are very unimportant and very flat, or they're characters that show us what happens when we refuse to change. And either way, it's meaningful. So do you have any questions about static versus dynamic and round versus flat? Because I think we're mostly done, but I think we've covered what we needed to today.
Um, I see in the chat that you put complex versus simple. Did you say that that was just another way of saying round versus flat?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be sure on that.
Yeah, it's just, a round character is more complex, more human, and the flat character is more stereotypical or simple. I can even do that too, human versus stereotype. That's another way of putting that round versus flat. Any other questions?
I think I'm good.
Well, thank you for coming. I could cover all that stuff, and we'll make sure and cover those two short stories next week, and we'll also cover probably the first short story, the birthmark, next week, and then the last one we'll discuss will be the um, the metamorphosis. But it's the longest story. It is long, so take time for it, because it's almost a novella. It's not really almost. It's not that long, but it feels long, and but it's really good, I think.
Yeah, I actually have a hard copy of that knocking around my house somewhere.
Really,
Yeah.
I've actually read a lot of Kafka, and it is fascinating stuff. It's a
I've
bit,
not read it yet though, but
yeah, it's a
I've
lot of
actually I was
psychological stuff that's going on. But
I
it's
admit
still
that I was
meaningful. This one's
I admit
weird
that I
though.
was
It's a weird story, so don't, you know, it's okay if you
yeah,
think,
I
wow, this story's weird.
I admit that I was curious about it actually a while back because I have it in the house and I was like wondered what it was about, but so I just googled like and looked at the plot and I was like, "Oh, that's sad."
It is, but
But
it's worth reading. It's still, honestly, it's kind of journalistic in style, but it's so, you just really feel for Gregor in that story. You get to where you're, at first you're like, what? And it's so weird, but then you'll I think, you learn to really, I don't know. I feel a tremendous amount of empathy for the poor guy.
you learn so
Really do.
much through these types of stories, you know?
Mhm.
They're so good.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying them. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good evening, and I will
You
talk to you
too.
soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.